let's get John Waters back on the programme. It's about time. Love John, love listening to him, as do you. Everyone I know back home has been following this with huge interest. Let me read you from thejournal.ie very briefly. The Supreme Court has reserved its decision in an appeal brought by Gemma O'Doherty and John Waters against the dismissal of their challenge of the constitutionality of laws introduced in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Against a decision by the High Court, later upheld by the Court of Appeal, not to grant them permission to bring their action against the measures on the basis it was misconceived and entirely without merit. Following the conclusion of submissions from the two applicants and the State yesterday, Chief Justice Donal O'Donnell said the court was reserving its decision and would give judgment at a later date. I'm delighted to welcome back to the show a friend of ours, brilliant writer, journalist and broadcaster. It's our very own John Waters. John Diagwit, welcome back. How are you? And he should be there, but he's not there. John, I wonder, have you, by any chance, accidentally muted your microphone? It does happen from time to time. If you want to check on that. He's definitely there, but we can't hear him. So what I'll do is I'll drag out another bit of music and we'll see can we get him back on. No, he's not. He's there, but he isn't there. Mercury must be in retrograde again. Every time I say that, I get some critical emails. People saying you shouldn't take the piss out of that, Richie. No, I can't hear John, and I don't think he can hear me, so we're going to have to do something about that very, very quickly. While I get him back, to call back, let's see. Hang on a second now. He might be there now. Are you there, John?
Hello, Richie.
Thanks be to God you're there. I don't know what happened there, but you're there.
How are you?
I'm 100%. Thanks. Yeah, I'm just musing as to what happened there. You know, lovers of astrology, they say when communications are difficult, they say that Mercury is in retrograde, John. Now, I have no idea what any of that means, but that's what they say. This was a big deal. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I as regards to technology, I never expect it to work. It always surprises me when it does. So I'm not at all surprised when it doesn't. You know, it's like seems to be the normative condition for technology not to work. That's my experience of it anyway.
You and I reckon, might be amongst the last people on planet Earth that used quarter-inch tape, reel-to-reel, Tascam machines in conducting interviews, because I did.
I do miss the old cassettes, Richie, going around in the car with the cassette player up on the dashboard,
God be with the days.
And you could just kind of hear the high treble notes, but that was enough.
that was enough for you then to go and transcribe and to write an article. But I actually had to physically do the old, with the little razor blade, cut the tape where you wanted to leave out any flannel and then reconnect the tape back together. I had to learn to do all of that. It's a skill that's no longer needed. It's brilliant to have you back. That was a big deal yesterday, and it did get coverage. Go ahead.
It was, Richie, because when you consider what you just read out there, that the Court of Appeal said that the case was without merit, and then the Supreme Court, we appealed to the Supreme Court, and they immediately said, well, not immediately, but they said, well, actually, it has merit, and you raise very important issues, and now this is a hard-fought battle because we're basically fighting the state at its most kind of pedantic and desperate. Because really what they're looking for is any kind of a little tiny technicality to put us out on. And it's very much like, as I said to the court yesterday, there were 7 judges. And I said to them, this is kind of like a game of gotcha. And I don't know if there is a game of gotcha, but you know what I mean, Richie? That it's like almost like those games we used to play as kids, like off-ground tag, and you had to stand on one leg and touch the wall with only your little finger, otherwise you were got, And it's very much like that kind of thing that you see, gotcha there. You didn't put the dot on that I. Or you didn't tell us that this was Ireland we were talking about. Something like that. It's of that level of triviality. I'll give you a concrete example. They keep going on about this concept of arguability, right? And they're saying that our case is not arguable. And I'm saying it's perfectly arguable because I'm a citizen of Ireland. I can read the Constitution. It tells me I have the right to walk down the street. If I'm stopped by a guard and told to go home because I haven't got a reasonable excuse and I'm not sick, that's a breach of my constitutional rights. That's the end of it, Richie. We're in then, right?
Yeah.
Now, their idea, the court was very interesting. I'll tell you a little bit about it in a while, but there was a lot of questioning back and forth, as we discovered yesterday. But at one point, the counsel for the barrister for the state was asked, well, can you give me an example of what an arguable case would be? And I swear to God, Richie, this is what he proposed, that we would have gone in and said that as an alternative, we would have proposed an alternative measure of set of measures to what the government actually put in place. In other words, that we would have kind of done a lesser form of tyranny. Do you remember Guinness Light years ago, Richie? You know, remember that they had this Guinness Light and the slogan was, they said it couldn't be done. Well, they were right. Do you remember that?
I do remember.
Now, this was a tyranny light. That's what the other side was proposing. That myself and Jim would have gone to the court and said, "Listen, we're only kind of low-level tyrants, you know. We only want to lock people up a little bit. We only want to abuse their rights a little bit, or less than the government anyway." That was the level of absolute nonsense that was coming out.
Can you confirm what I've just heard from you? Because my head is spinning. The other side, representing the government,
yes,
they said that John and Gemma didn't have an arguable case. If they did, John and Gemma would have come in with an alternative, with a lockdown light alternative.
They were given this as an example, and
Unbelievable.
the only example that they could come up with.
Wow!
Like when they were pushed by several of the judges on the bench. Now, I don't know. I mean, like, you see, there's a very interesting thing here. I won't go into the technicalities of it, but in general, in principle, the problem here is that the generality of cases that are taken against to defend the Constitution or to defend constitutional rights tend to be individual plaintiffs, or indeed a group of plaintiffs, taking up a particular grievance as a result of some law or other, right? So it would be somebody who had some issue with the law that had infringed on their individual constitutional rights, and they would generally take that by way of what's called plenary summonses, where they would actually have the possibility of getting damages at the end, right? Now, our case was not in principle like that. It was a very unusual case. In fact, I would say it was a unique case in the history of the Constitution, which has been there for, I think, 85 years now. Or something of that order. Yeah, 85 years. That we were actually going as citizens. We were taking a public interest case, and we were looking for a judicial review, specifically stating, and there's a very good reason for this, Richie, as you'll understand. First of all, it was an urgent case. We wanted to get it into court within weeks because of the situation that the country was facing. We wanted it to be public interest. But above all, we did not want the media, who were totally hostile and state-sponsored and malevolent towards us from the beginning, to be able to say that we were doing this for damages. We didn't want damages. We wanted to fight the issue. And for that reason, our case was different. And then for that reason also, we were not particularly emphasizing any personal loss or damage to ourselves. In the first place, it was very early days. What we were emphasizing was that we were citizens and we believed we had the right to walk the street. And that ought to have been enough. They were stopping us walking the street. They were saying to us, you can't leave your house unless you have a reasonable excuse. And if the guard doesn't like your excuse, you have to go home again. So this, see, Richie, I look back on this now. We're 2 years down the road nearly. And I swear to God, I actually wake up some days and I start thinking about this and I think, did that really happen? Did they really do that? I can't believe they did that. Because while it's going on, there's a certain aura or air of normalization about it. It's there and you have to deal with it, But then you think, but sure, that's impossible. This is a democracy. We have a constitution. Our rights are paramount. How could they possibly do that? And particularly when it was not the Black Plague.
And even if it was.
Even if it was, Richie,
Yeah.
well, that came up, and I was asked that question, and I said, well, okay, yeah, there would be. One of the judges asked me, was there any situation where I would say that these kind of measures or anything? I said, well, I don't think lockdown is a measure that is appropriate at all. But if you're asking me if the Constitution could be suspended temporarily in some instances, for something really grievous, well, I can't rule it out. I'd say theoretically, yes, but I wouldn't like to see it happen. And there's a very interesting analogy about this that was done by a judge some years ago. He's dead now, Adrian Hardiman. He was on the Supreme Court, and this came up in a case in a very kind of weird way, kind of eccentric way. But it was a case about fallout from the last economic financial crisis and all that. But it came up in this case, and he said, yes, the state can encroach on your rights temporarily. Now, and the analogy he gave was, look, if there's a fire, and the flames are coming out the side window of a house, and the fire brigade arrive, and the only way they can get to the fire is to put their ladder into the garden of the neighbour, and the neighbour isn't home. They do not need to apply to the High Court for permission to put the ladder in. But they put the ladder in, they put the fire out, and they take the ladder out again, and that's that. Now, the ladder has been on our lawn for 2 years. And it's still there, despite what people say. We know it's there because these politicians never stop telling us something that is actually impossible to say, that there'll be another wave next year. Not in the history of viruses or bacterial flus or anything like that has anybody ever been able to predict when another wave or if another wave would come. This is set up. It is coming. They're going to do it again next year.
You really believe that, do you? Because variants, you make a very good point there. Historically, and I've really looked into this, variants of any infection always scale down. They don't get worse. They get much more mild.
They do.
Yeah.
Yes, that's true. That's right. But this is quite extraordinary. And I mean, you see, the trouble with the court process, it's part of the nature of it. But, from the layperson's point of view, it's very frustrating because you're inclined to speak passionately about issues like this. And this doesn't go down at all well in court. They want you to keep it very dry and kind of, technical and argue legal points. And if you cross over, they accuse you of speaking rhetorically. You're making speeches, Mr. Waters, again, you're becoming rhetorical, And I said, well, what else would you do in these circumstances? I said, we're trying to defend the Constitution that we inherited to make sure that it's fit for our children to live in the country with. Can we have a serious conversation about this? Now, I have to say, the people on the court, I say, were very civil. I've been in courtrooms, and as I'm sure you, Richie, have, and you've seen very obnoxious judges.
Yeah.
These people were not in anything like that. They were very civil, decent people, But I was very interesting. I went in, because, and this is this last process of this. There are several layers of this procedure. We had to put in written submissions first. Then there was a whole lot of stuff about, we had case management hearings, and then we had to prepare booklets, and we had to cooperate with the other side in doing that. And that was grand. There was a bit of to and fro and all that. And then there was a set of further inquiries from the court, which we had to answer. And then finally, you're going in and you're supposed to do what they call your oral submissions, right? And I spent 2 weeks working on these here and working with Gemma and all that. And writing it all up and rewriting it and thinking maybe that's too much and maybe that's wrong, and tearing it up and writing it again. And then I go into court, and it's because I'm not quite clear in my head exactly what does it mean, oral submissions, And I'll tell you what oral submissions means, Richie. It means essentially an ambush, right? You go in and you get into the third or fourth sentence and they interrupt you, and that's right. Then that's the end of your speech, right? Because you're on your feet all the time answering questions. But in fairness, they did it to both sides. And, the question, they did a good, you could see they were actually seriously engaging with the issues and so on. And they were trying to solve problems or issues that clarify for themselves, things that I don't know the answer to, because what do you do in a situation like this where you're simply waking up and saying, look, there's a bunch of guards outside my window stopping cars. I don't want to be telling them where I'm going. It's none of their business.
Yeah.
and I don't want to have this, feeling in the pit of my stomach every time I walk down the street, or whatever. I don't want to be thinking, can people come to my house? Can I go and visit my grandmother? Whatever. And so that's the basis of our case. It never happened before, Richie, in the history of the state. Never. Nor any state that I know of in the Western world, in the free world, as it used to be called.
This is history. Let me just remind our listeners, not that they're stupid, they don't need reminding, but I'm going to tell them anyway. This is historic stuff. John Waters, journalist, author, broadcaster, and Gemma O'Doherty argued before the Supreme Court of Ireland yesterday. This is historic stuff, because the High Court had said that John and Gemma didn't have any right to argue against the introduction of COVID measures. They said you don't have any right to bring action against those measures. And John and Gemma said, we'll see about that. And they've taken it to the Supreme Court. It's astounding stuff. I mean, I would have given anything to be able to sit in there, quiet as a mouse, and listened to all of that yesterday. I'm delighted to hear that these people took you seriously, respected you, and interrupted the other side as much as they interrupted you. I really am. I mean, this is massive.
No. And I'll tell you another thing, that we had quite a lot of our followers coming, and we were concerned that the court wasn't, obviously these courtrooms are not big, and during the COVID thing, virtually nobody was let in fact, and we really railed against that right throughout the process, because there were, no members of the public were being allowed in, which is a complete breach of Article 34 of the Irish Constitution, because courts are supposed to happen in public. That means the door of the court must be open. But COVID, and there was posters to festoon in every courtroom we were in, and every second seat was plastered with a poster, and you couldn't sit on it. But yesterday, a very kind usher there, working with one of our people, there was, whatever number of people there, they actually did relays of people, half an hour at a time, and allowed people to go into the court, our crowd, and spend half an hour there and see a certain amount of the thing. And I thought it was a very beautiful thing, and I have to say, we've had a terrible sense in the first period at the High Court and the Court of Appeal that we were met with absolutely obnoxiousness all the time, from the judges, from the registrars, from the staff, from everybody. We were treated like enemies of the state. But since we went to the Supreme Court level, I have to really say, and I mean, Gemma mightn't agree with me. She doesn't like me praising these fellas at all, and fair enough. We're supposed to be, fighting the system and all that. But nevertheless, fair is fair. They were really courteous and did everything they could to be, be reasonable with us, and we did it also with them, because we haven't ever done otherwise. So it, at that level, it was a satisfactory experience. But I don't know. I couldn't tell you. I didn't. I felt a bit. Yourself, Richie, when you never do as well as you want to. You know what I mean? You in any situation, very rarely, unless you score a hat trick in a match or whatever it is, you very rarely come off the pitch thinking, well, I did every single thing. Because when you're actually under pressure like that, and you're feeling, well, I've all this preparation done, and they're asking me questions now, which I've actually answered in my script, but could you wait? And you can't be saying that to Supreme Court judges, could you wait until, so in that sense, you lose your track, and you say, well, okay, I'll fight the battle. I have an hour and a half. I'll keep running and keep, chasing the ball.
I'm sure you played a blinder. I'm not patronising you. I'm sure you played a blinder. Fionnuala Murphy met you yesterday and wants me to mention that and to say hello to you and thank you. And if you go onto my website and even the Facebook, the amount of people, Irish people and others, who are saying thanks for this dogged determination not to let this go and to take it before the Supreme Court. You're not one for that soft talk. I'm guessing in the time I've known you, you're not doing this for any adulation. You're certainly not doing it for any attention.
No.
But you're doing a remarkable thing, both of you. It's a remarkable thing.
Richie, I mean, this is the funny thing. In one of the last sets of correspondences between the other side, and our side, and then the court, there was this kind of, or it was actually in the responses to our written submissions, and they were hypothesizing about why we were doing this. We were offered by the Supreme Court free pro bono lawyers to be appointed by the court. Now, we took this view, Richie, here, was that, look, there are 20,000 solicitors in Ireland registered and 2,000 registered barristers with the Bar Council. And not one of them stood up and did what we did. We thought they would. I certainly did. I thought that we'd be killed in the rush and that we'd be trampled. There would be so many applications of this kind going through back in April of 2020. There were none others. There were no others. For that reason, in the first instance, and then you see, when we saw all this stuff inside in the system, it was like the entire system was not alone totally behind it, but actually, they weren't just obeying it; they were totally with it, and that was very dismaying. And I said this to the court yesterday when we went in. I think I said this to you before, like when we saw all these posters on the court. I said to the court, I says, it's like if I was in a charge of murder, and I walked into this courtroom. And there was a big poster on the wall with a picture of me on it, and wanted, Waters, murder 1. It's the same thing. I said, it's prejudicial. This is the difficulty with this case, that, that it has, the propaganda is ubiquitous. Now, the thing is then, speculating, well, why did they not take up the offer of free lawyers? Which people would say, well, God, that's very good. But the problem is, Richie, you would have no control.
No.
We know that once that took over,
they would have spoken yesterday where you and Gemma spoke. They would have made. You're absolutely right.
And they would tell you, no, I won't make that case for you.
Yeah.
Or no, that's not the way we see it. That's the way lawyers are. They will never make an argument to a court that they don't necessarily believe in themselves. And we didn't know any lawyers who believed in the things we believed about this. So we said, okay, we've done it so far. We'll go the next round. It's not easy, but the thing is, like, I found that funny because I was actually, it was on my mind that if it came up, what I was going to say to the court was, if I'd been offered a choice this morning at 9:00 to go into the court as planned or go on my holidays to Kiev, I'd be on the plane.
Right.
That's because I tell you something, it's the stress of it, you see.
Yeah.
It's the absolute stress that you feel in a place like that, because obviously there's a lot of pressure on you to get.
Well, there's so much at stake. You see, there's so much invested in it. Absolutely,
and it's easy to slip up and throw it away by saying something that is. I've seen this before. I've watched it. Because as a lay person, look, people say, well, I know about the law. I know a certain amount, but that's through learning, through experience, but. You could make mistakes, and I've seen it, and or you don't see a technical thing, you don't see a technical point, and I've seen it. There was a very good judge, Adrian Hardiman, this judge, I mentioned it before. Like I've seen him now, and he was a very kind of dogged fella on the bench, but he was a great judge. But I've seen him at times, like, and he'd have someone in front of him, a witness or whatever it would be, or even a barrister. And he'd see something in the case that they wouldn't see. And you could see that he was genuinely trying to help them, but they weren't seeing what he was saying,
right.
And he'd be getting more and more impatient with them. And they would think that he was just being ratty. But it was frustration because, and that kind of thing can happen in the heat of the moment. You're missing the obvious thing that they see. And they're actually saying to you, look, you have a better case than you know. And these kind of things can happen. It's comical in some respects, but that's what I mean. It's a stressful.
All of this was on your mind before you went in, thinking that I'll miss an opportunity to say something and misread one of the judges.
It'll take me several weeks to kind of calm down and unwind from it all, because I've been living, eating, and drinking it now for like 2 months in this patch, 2 years altogether. But in this particular phase, we got the right we got the nod on the 23rd of November. So like that's nearly 4 months ago. Like, so we've been living it ever since, and trying to how are we going to do it, and winnowing everything down to get it in, because there's all kinds of constraints, like word limits and so on, and submissions and so on. And like they throw things back at you if they're not happy. I mean, I did a number of pages from textbooks for as attachments or whatever as exhibits, and they threw them back. So they're not the quality is not good enough, and that's fair enough as well. But what I'm saying is that there's you want to see the amount of paperwork, Richie. We carried in 2 big boxes on a trolley yesterday, and funny enough, that in the court thing they said we end up not using much of it, but it has to be there in case one or other judge wants to pick up some point. And so there's a lot involved in it, but fundamentally, you see, this case is so simple in a way, the funny thing is that there have been several applications now for the same thing, for the other kind of application, the other kind of case that I talked about, where it's one person with one grievance. And it's specific, and it's, you can make an affidavit about it and just set out the core details, and that's it. That's your case. And a lot of those cases went through with it on the nod, as we thought ours would go. But ours was blocked because why? Because it was actually going to the fundamentals of all this. We were going right to we were asking the most fundamental questions. Like there's one article in the Irish Constitution, 2833, it says, and it essentially makes this impossible, constitutionally impossible.
Makes the lockdown constitutionally impossible.
Yes, It's because what it requires is for an emergency to be declared, there is only one set of conditions, that is war or armed rebellion. And, back in 1939, at the time, just before World War II, this came up for discussion, and it was felt at that time by the leader, De Valera. Emma De Valera was the Taoiseach at the time. And it was De Valera felt in particular that the wording was not quite right for what they were expecting to happen. In other words, a war that didn't involve Ireland directly. And they felt that it was too precise in that regard, and that they needed to change it. And there was a massive discussion that happened out then among all the civil servants. There's an excellent book, actually, which was written by one of the judges on the bench yesterday.
Go on.
And he was talking about, he describes and he produces a correspondence between all the civil servants. And some of them are putting out the idea that, look, there's no need for this to be so narrow. We should have the capacity to have other kinds of emergencies included. And this was debated up and down and up and down. And in the end, De Valera said, no, that's not necessary, and we're not doing it. And that's the end of it. And indeed, to come back again to Mr. Hardiman, who 10 years ago, the same thing, when he came up before him, he said the same thing. Under no circumstances, if you want to have to suspend the Constitution, now you have to have a referendum. But the thing is, they claimed, Richie, well, we didn't use that. Well, I said, well, then it's a backstop. You can't just say it's not there, because if it was a situation where it's not as if they forgot about it. They knew that these possibilities were there. And you can't just sort of move 100 yards away and build again without planning permission, Hardiman said, no, under no circumstances. And I've no doubt about this, that this is 100%. Has to be. The court cannot. They cannot decide other than that this is actually unconstitutional, in my submission. But who knows? I've some of the convoluted reasonings that I've seen coming out of courts in recent years, would make you dizzy to read them, because your brain gets tied in knots.
You can't believe that they reached that decision. Let me ask you this, because I know nothing of these courts. So in the United States, there are 9 Supreme Court justices. There are 7, if we'll call them that, in Ireland. Am I to understand? No, I'm not. I'm going to ask because I don't know. I don't know the answer to this. Will one of the judges write an opinion? Is that how it works in Ireland? Or?
Yeah. Well, in fact, there are 9 judges in the panel, in the total panel of the Supreme Court.
Oh, is there? Only 7 in the actual hearing?
Well, the hearing usually has either 3, 5, or 7 judges. This was the highest. This is the highest number, and that's really interesting in itself, But yes, you could have 3, 4 judges giving judgments. You might, it depends. You might even have dissenting judgments, one way or the other, depending. So you could actually, in theory, all 7 judges, I don't think this will happen, but you could, in theory, have all 7 judges giving individual judgments. And you could have a 4-3, you could have a 5-2, you could have, whatever. So you could have 7-0, 7-0, one way or the other, So that's the way it is. But it's I have to say like that, this, in a certain sense, this is a very, the bizarre thing about it, Richie, is that we're still at the same point as we were at 12 o'clock noon on the 15th of April 2020. We're still waiting. We're starting to start the process.
But you're going to get an answer now. The thing is, you've done this yesterday, this extraordinary historical thing the two of you have done, and now you've got to wait. They said at a later date. So as far as you and Gemma are concerned, that's it, really. You have to wait.
No. You see, yes and no. The outcome of this will only be, the best outcome for us will only be that we will get the leave we were denied in the first place. Right. More than likely. Now, there is one outside possibility, what I just said there about Article 2833. I would have thought, and I said as much to the court yesterday, that this could decide it straight off without any judicial.
Yeah, review. That's what I was. That was in my mind when I just said what I said, that they might say, look, it's open and shut, basically.
Yeah,
it's unconstitutional.
I put that to them. That it's there. That we don't need to investigate this. It's cut and dried. It's open and shut. It's over. Now, I don't know. Again, they might have all kind of technical reasons for not doing that, and they might that's one option. They might say, okay, but you can go and judicially review it, and the High Court will decide, and then we will walk it up through the system again. But that's what will have to happen. That's the best outcome. And then, of course, they could shoot us down completely, in which case then we have the option of taking it to Europe, and that's another day's work. Taking
it to Europe. I want to ask you about Ukraine and Russia and other things that are happening around that. But just to finish with this case, I'm not being sarcastic. This morning, how many national or commercial radio stations phoned you or Gemma to ask you to come on to talk about what was basically one of the biggest days in Irish jurisprudence history? And I'm not being sensational in saying that. It was. How many phone calls did you get?
None.
Fucking hell.
Not one, Richie. Not one.
No.
Well, I mean, they know we have no time for them, and they know we're not. That we're well past that point anymore at this stage, because they have treated us abominably.
Yeah.
They have been corrupt at every turn, and I'm not just saying the mainstream media. Some of the off-mainstream ones here, I won't mention them, but they were just as bad. There was an enormous amount of hostility, malevolence, and jealousy, I would say, that we had actually taken a step that nobody else had taken, and took it early. I mean, we took it, as I say, we started this at Easter week in 2020, just when the whole thing was kicking off. And Richie, the problem is, and I've said this repeatedly to the court, one of the big problems with all of this has been that the mainstream media is completely state-sponsored. And people are therefore only getting one side of the picture. And the consequence of that is that essentially what has happened is that a kind of pseudo-reality has been constructed around people. It's kind of like a stage set, that because that's what when you find people are not seeing the same thing as we're seeing. They're not aware that of the things we're aware of. The court yesterday, I felt strongly, was not aware of some of the things we were saying.
I was going to ask this at the outset, because when we had a brief text chat today, that's the thing that you mentioned. And this is, I think this is more than a salient point. This is a really important point. These people don't see where all of this is going, the dystopia. That's the way, I mean, we're in dystopia now. They don't see it, they don't get it. And you're convinced they don't get it.
Well, I had to point out to them, which is something I've noticed in right along the way with several cases, and in particular the Simon Dolan case in the UK, that the outcome of the judgments right along the way were tautological, they were circular. That, yes, these are extreme measures, this is unprecedented, yes, but there was a pandemic. Therefore, the government was entitled to do whatever it wanted to do, or whatever it felt was necessary to do. Which, in other words, as it begs the question, it basically is it answers the question before it asks it. And I said this is the problem here as well, because you could feel, because repeatedly people, even the judges on the bench and the counsel for the other side, were speaking about quote unquote the pandemic as if it were a given. As if it were, and I said to them, look, you might think so, but we're here to question it.
Well, what's the point of having a constitution? What's the point of having any rules or laws?
That's what I said. We can shred it. If you guys, I told them at the end, I said, it's up to you now. We've reached a fork in the road. Either we're going to have a constitution or we can just shred it. Because if this is a precedent, this is what the founders, the framers of the Constitution, were worried about most of all back in 1939 when they did that amendment. And that amendment, by the way, that I spoke about, that was actually done by a vote of the Parliament, the Oireachtas, because it was in the 3-year preliminary period of the rolling out of the Constitution, so they didn't have to go to the people. But that was their greatest fear, that a future government might be given an instrument of tyranny. And I said, here we are. Here we are. I said, now the precedent has been set. There is nothing to stop unless you guys actually step in and set down guidelines. You gave us the order of unconstitutionality that we asked for. Failing that you certainly set limits around what has happened and make commentaries on what, because some of these guys on this panel, and we deliberately used their judgments in our submissions, have actually spoken about the language of the Constitution, because it has all this beautiful language, words like inalienable, imprescriptible, inviolable, indefeasible, which are the strongest words probably in the English language.
Yeah.
They mean basically you cannot give things up, you cannot take them away, they're absolute, they're inviolable, your home is inviolable, and yet these politicians have been telling, no, you can only have X and Y numbers of people in your house at any given time. And I said, this is up to, and these guys have written judgments which concur with our view of that.
That's amazing. The level of research that you both went into to dig out. I mean, wonderful. We have an idea who the justices are going to be, and you look into their previous rulings. Brilliant. Not to be sarcastic or to be belligerent, but just to say to them, hey, listen, you're actually on our side.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
But you see, this is the interesting thing, Richie, and this is what you run up against, and this is the real danger of legal systems now in the modern era. They have a thing in the courts called the separation of powers, which means that whereas, and people don't often realise this, that the judiciary are actually part of the government. In Ireland, that's very much the case. There are 3 parts of the government. The Parliament, which is we call the Oireachtas in Irish. There's the executive, that's the government itself, and then the judiciary. But those 3 parts are supposed to be, theoretically anyway, separate, and particularly the judiciary, that it doesn't cross, it doesn't interfere. And yet it has a supervisory role in making sure that the Constitution is upheld. And this is a very tricky one for the layperson to get their head around, and there's been a lot of discussion about it in this whole case. But, the judiciary, they don't like intruding on politicians. And then you think how circular that is, because they're all appointed by politicians. That's a real risk, The tendency that has happened in recent times about judges, that they tend to be, in America you see this all the time, where everybody assumes that the court is decided, that almost any controversial case will be decided on the numbers, in the sense that, well, you have 4 conservative judges and 5 or whatever it is, 5 liberal judges. That means the liberal side of the argument will always win. That's a terrible state of affairs, and that's a relatively new thing, where judges, once they were appointed, used to go into their whole thing was that they had to learn how to be objective and to take themselves out of the equation and decide. And that guy Hardyman was really brilliant at that, because he was a raving liberal in political terms. He was campaigning on all kinds of things when he was a young fella. But when he was sat in that court, he upheld the Constitution better than anybody I've ever seen.
He left his own prejudices at the front door or in his office.
And I don't know if that's a kind of now an old-fashioned thing. I don't know. I'm not judging any of these guys, as it were. I have a lot of respect for these people, and in particular for several of them in particular. They're brilliant judges, and I think decent people, and they have been very courteous and cordial to us, I have to say.
And are those positions, John, it's lovely to hear that again, that they, whereas you didn't get that sort of treatment at the Court of Appeal or at the High Court, you did get it at the Supreme Court. I should know this, I'm embarrassed I don't, but hey, listen, knowledge is power, you're going to empower me now. Are the positions permanent? Are they life positions in Ireland?
Well, they're permanent they do retire at a certain point,
Right.
But they go on quite a long time. I'm not sure what the age limit is, but they certainly go on, there's no hurry on them to go. But then they are replaced, then they're replaced by new appointees, and I don't personally think that's a very satisfactory system, but I can't think of a better one, basically. I don't know, because, almost anything you could think of would be, capable of being contaminated in some way, but I certainly think it has affected the system at the lower levels very badly. I mean, what happens is, generally speaking, that in fairness, the better judges, the better minds reach the top, for sure, to the very top layer. But down at the lower levels, and the lower levels probably go up quite a bit, that's not the case. You have a lot of political hacks who are just there because they were good at putting up posters.
Right.
And as a result, you get very bad decisions and very malevolent judges in many instances. And I've seen a lot of that in my time.
Me too. Back in Waterford, God, I could tell you stories, and you could tell me even better stories. Let me just do a quick. It's 10 minutes past 6. John Waters. John is one of Ireland's finest columnists. He really is. I'm not just saying that. And authors. He has yesterday done something historic. John and Gemma O'Doherty, 2 years of work, ended up in the Supreme Court because the Court of Appeal, and before that the High Court, denied John and Gemma the right to bring an argument against the constitutionality, or arguing that the lockdowns were unconstitutional. The Supreme Court heard them yesterday. That's an amazing thing. They will reserve their judgment for a later date, and I suppose it's you're playing the waiting game now. I'm just mindful of time, and there are other things I wanted to talk about. If there's anything else you want to tell us about yesterday, feel free to do that. I would like to ask you about some of the horrible things that are happening here in this country against academics who are criticising the anti-Russian propaganda. It's astonishing what's happening here, and some of this stuff where Russian businessmen and women are having their assets seized, and tennis players are being told if they don't make public proclamations against Putin, they might be banned from Wimbledon. All this crazy, scary Orwellian stuff. But if there is something else you wanted to say about the Supreme Court,
we've covered it reasonably well, Richie. I'm happy to talk about that. I mean, I think this is, again, another symptom of the madness that has erupted in Western society, civilization, in the past decade, or, it's probably been brewing for a long time, much longer than that, but very intensely in the last 7 or 8 years. And a lot of it has to do, I think, with the collapse of the mainstream media, because everybody now in public life seems to know that they can manipulate the media through power and money. And therefore, there is no answerability now in the way there used to be. It's absolutely unthinkable that people would be sanctioned just because of their nationality, financially and otherwise, and punished in that way. And now, not alone is it happening, but people actually defend it, and they just shrug off any criticism, and it just goes on. Like the Western leaderships, most of them are insane, but they are destroying the West. They're actually shooting themselves, not just in both feet, but they're actually putting the gun to our heads now, and they're about to pull the trigger. Because with these sanctions against Russia, for example, they have created massive problems economically for their own countries, for the West, for Europe, and for America. Probably for Europe most of all. And they seem to, they're going around in this kind of vainglorious trance, thinking they're heroes, when they're absolutely idiots. Vladimir Putin is Vladimir Putin, and he's a tough guy, and he's I'd say a pretty ruthless guy, but his interest is in protecting his country, and he has a case, and he makes it well, that NATO, he doesn't want NATO up on his doorstep, and that was an agreement they've had going way back, and there's the Minsk agreements and so on and so forth, and these have all been breached or have been just ignored and treated with contempt, and that he had a certain limit. There's all kinds of aspects to that. There also is no doubt about it that this was provoked deliberately by the West, by America, and so on, at this particular time, for reasons of their own. They wanted to create a bit of a distraction and diversion from what was about to come down the pipe anyway with regard to hyperinflation and so on. They've made it far worse now, but now they're attributing it all to Ukraine, you see. And this is all a set-up job. It's quite extraordinary the way that it has actually gone seamlessly. The kind of what we've talked about before, which is this kind of trance that has been created around the COVID question, where people are actually, they're actually numb almost mentally, and the same thing now. They have now taken up the Ukraine cause in the same way, mindlessly, without actually looking into what's going on. The meaning of all these biolabs that have been found there. What is that? Has anybody any interest in that? And so on. So I think that I really, I shudder when I look at the people who lead our countries in the West now. And I think that the world is now dividing. There was, in some ways that's a good thing, because this globalist project is really dangerous. But certainly it's going to happen now that Russia, China, India, Iran, all these countries are going to back away into their own corners and will try to cooperate between themselves. But you're going to have a very stark division between the West and those countries, I think, in the not too distant future. And this is like,
can I jump in there? That's a really interesting analysis, because if you're right, and I don't know that you're wrong at all, you might very well be right. The agenda is going to go on in any case, and in those countries you mentioned, I agree. The Anglo, as somebody put it to me recently on the program, the US, the Anglo Zionist, if you want to even include Israel's meddling, have done most of the terrible things in terms of invading countries and killing millions of people and displacing millions more in the last 3-4 decades, no doubt about that. But for my money, these other countries are not innocent in terms of the way they treat their own populations. Like, I don't see Vladimir Putin's government or I didn't see them as standing up to any of the tyranny of COVID. Not the Chinese either. I mean, the Chinese have gone into almost a total lockdown there again. So if you're right, and these countries, we get some kind of a new, much bigger kind of a Cold War, the citizens of these countries are going to be under the jackboot just as much as we are. If that makes any sense.
It does, Richie. But I think there's, and this is all coming, there's a lot of stuff coming out now, Richie, as a result of the discovery of those biolabs in Ukraine. But first of all, I would say, yes, my attitude has been always about the West and the rest, that, okay, America may do some pretty, mean things and some nasty things down to the years. But in general, they're our villains, as well. If they're villainous, then they're our villains, and they're protecting our children and our societies and so on. And it's a tough world and so on. But one of the things that I out of the last couple of years that really kind of made me sit back was just what we're talking about. That suddenly our own leaders turn on us.
Yeah.
Right? And at the same time, they don't, as with someone like Trudeau, they don't stop talking up democracy. And it's quite clear to us all now, I think, anybody who's sentient, that they have no interest in democracy. So now the question is actually a little more open, like, well, are they better than Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping?
Yeah.
Are they really? Like, morally, are they? And on what basis? So I'm kind of looking askance now at the whole thing and saying, okay, well, yeah, maybe. Now, there's another thing here that I think is really, this is a bit controversial, but it's beginning to emerge. Very open question now as to the sources of these, of the COVID, so-called SARS-CoV-2 viruses. And I think a lot of stuff has yet to come out about this. And I think that some of the theories that we've heard may not actually stand up, because there's a lot of very strange patterns when you look very closely at it. And as regards to Russia, for example, what you said about Russia, I don't know if that's true. I think, you see, Russia really had a series of outbreaks over the period. But now, if you look, it's had a very serious outbreak in the last month or 6 weeks, two months, right? And then it suddenly stopped. Now, there's lots of different theories on this. But one of the theories that I'm hearing increasingly now is that a lot of these, what happened here, these pathogens, arose out of biolabs all over the world and were placed there by malevolent agents.
Not just in Wuhan, but elsewhere.
Well, Wuhan is a different story. But I mean, if you look back to China, how did that virus burst out in China? It burst out there first in very late October or early November 2019, and I actually came across, there was a report on ABC television in April 2020, which cited 4 different intelligence sources as confirmed that they were aware of that at the time, right? Now, how would they have been aware of something that nobody else was aware of?
Yeah.
You see, now that question, then Iran had an attack in February that year. Well, how come China and Iran, who are both, not part of the West,
the axis of evil, yeah.
And there was no connection between the Iranian strain and the China strain. And there was no way that it could have been transmitted. And another thing, in no country that you can identify, there has never been a patient zero.
That's really, really interesting. Now, there are some listening to this who might say, that's right, John, it's a very good point. No relationship between the strain in Iran or in China, and the timings are incredibly similar. So there are those who believe that COVID is a wag the dog situation, that the virus itself never existed.
Well, there's all that. And this is the thing. I mean, again, we're speculating, and I'll be the first to say that, and there's so many different elements and so many different theories and, questions. Was it a wet market? Was it a Wuhan? Was it a bioweapon of someone else's? And so the way I treat this, Richie, if I can say it like this, is I treat it like I try to build an imaginative image of it, and I still haven't got mine. So one thing I say is contingent. And it's evolving and tentative. But I kind of treat it like building a dry stone wall, that you're building your wall and you have your pile of stone around you there, and you're trying out different stones, and some of them fit and some of them don't fit. And the ones you don't fit, you don't throw them away. You leave them to one side and say, well, I'll try that again.
Yeah.
And I'm beginning to see more coherence now since these bioweapons were found in Ukraine. These factories, or whatever they would be called, because these are all over the place. There's one in Georgia, for example, and they're doing all kinds of experiments on them, and they're how to convey pathogens via insects, mosquitoes, and
that's
so on.
That's right.
Yeah.
And domestic animals, and all sorts of crazy things. Yeah.
Yes, and they're designing pathogens which can actually attack in particular ethnicities, which is a very scary thing. And
who's the they? Can I ask you this? John Waters is our guest, and it's 21 and a half minutes past the hour.
Richie, I'll tell you who they were. It's the Americans.
Right. So it's intelligence. It's deep state stuff coming out of America. Yeah.
Yes. The theory. What I've heard was that this first attack on China happened in October 2019 under Trump's leadership. But the theory of the people that we're talking about, they say Trump didn't even know it was happening.
No, he wouldn't have known, no. If it's true, if that theory is
if that's true.
Up, yeah.
But the thing is, you see, like, they know. I mean, that woman Newland from the State Department, she admitted it under oath there recently, that there was bioweapons and that they were involved in all kinds of experiments. And she
oversaw the overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych in Ukraine in 2014,
yes.
Victoria Newland.
See, this is where I come down to, Richie, and I come down to this really belatedly, because I've been out there. I won't go into it now, but I've been out there defending American activities before.
Yeah.
But I'm really looking now at not just America under Biden. I'm not, the Obama and all that. Trump. My jury's out on Trump. I say I don't want people thinking I'm a Trumper, that I'm totally with Trump on anything, but I look at the leaders of the West. I look at Trudeau. I look at Johnson. I look at Biden. I look at Macron. All these people, and I say, what distinguishes them in their behaviour from Xi Jinping? Right now,
nothing.
So, and we may not even know the truth about Xi Jinping because everything they tell us is lies.
Can I give you my? I began doing shows like this back in 2009, 2010. And before that, a few years break, but before that, commercial and national radio production and presenting. So here's where I am. It's amazing I'm saying this to you after all this time that we've been speaking now for a couple of years or just under. I'm at the point now where I do believe there's a depopulation agenda. I don't have a lot of time for people. I sympathise with them, but I don't have a lot of time for them. People who try who identify certain communities or certain groups either ethnic or say it for me, or cultural. There are people who seek to blame cultural or ethnic groups for it. Like, I'll have people who'll phone in the show and they'll say it's a Jewish conspiracy.
No.
It's an Israeli conspiracy. It isn't. It's not.
No.
I don't believe in
No.
any of that. I'll tell you what I think, and I'll be very brief with this, even though I'm not being brief. There is an agenda. Who or what is controlling it? I'm not able to identify it, but I'll tell you what I do believe. I now believe, with no evidence, I have no evidence to back it up, except circumstantial. I now believe that the leaders of every country in the world are in on it one way or another. And those leaders have never, I believe now, have never made policy decisions that they're given their orders from other men or other women, the names of which we don't know. That's what I've come to believe. Well, after years.
I'd nearly go that full distance with you. I certainly, think it's a very real possibility that, in effect, we're all being taken for suckers.
All being played, yeah.
Yeah, but I still hold out the hope that there are people within that who are real, even though they may not reveal themselves. Now, I don't know who they would. You could talk in terms. You could talk about Trump. You could talk about Putin. You could even talk about Xi. I don't know because who knows? We don't know much about China. Internally, most people don't know about it, and generally, our culture isn't very well informed about it. But I'm coming to this slowly as well, Richie. The depopulation agenda and all the rest of it, because even yet, I am viscerally holding back from that. I do abstractly, intellectually accept that the evidence is overwhelming that something like this is afoot. But I've never met the kind of people who would actually sit in a room and plan something like that.
Me neither.
And I therefore can barely believe in their existence.
And that's why I always leave room. You see, you're an old school journalist. You're honouring the tradition of journalism by saying, yes, I have to accept it. It might be possible. Most journalists today won't. They'll flatly dismiss it, and they will seek to ridicule. If it's somebody who phones in, they will seek to put them down and ridicule them. I don't have any evidence to support this, but years of listening to people like Jim Marrs, rest in peace, great Texan writer, David Icke. David has been vilified, laughed at, mocked, derided. Sitting with them, listening to them patiently, and them patiently explaining and wide open to questions, wide open to be stopped.
Yes.
And say, hang on, David, that's absolute bollocks. Tell me why. Wide open and say, well, let me explain, Richie, and here's a bit of a document or whatever. So that's why if I had to put a fiver on it, I would say we are all being played. But like yourself, I leave lots of room for I might be wrong, and there might very well be genuine men and women working within the systems, within the matrix, for want of a better word, who might not be with it or part of the agenda. Yes, of course, I would leave it open.
Well, I'm the same, because since this thing started, for example, in the COVID context alone, the information has been coming intentionally in bits and pieces, and never has been, because of the corruption of the mainstream media and their refusal to do their job. In fact, their insistence on doing a job which is the antithesis of what they ought to be doing. In other words, they're lying instead of telling the truth. The alternative to lying is not necessarily that. You could simply not say anything. They could take down their tents and go away, but they insist on staying there, pretending that they're still journalists, and that's a terrifying thing.
Yeah.
So, I've tried to, as I say, like my dry stone wall, just keep the stones close. Watch to say, well, just that doesn't fit now, but maybe tomorrow week I'll try it again in a different place.
It might make sense then.
And that's what I think a journalist has to do. It's like, you're, in a certain sense, you're like a detective. You're trying to put together the case, the book of evidence. And sometimes you're going down a path that's wrong, but you have to go down it to find out that it's wrong. And you might, while you're going down it, believe in that thesis or that theory, and you follow it. And then you get to the bottom and say, well, it doesn't fit. But I'll still recall, I'll hold it there and I'll leave it to one side, and maybe it'll come back into play. And that's the way I do my work. And they've always done it that way. But journalists, you're right, they don't do that now. They form, they're trained in college. I mean, the old saying, they're not taught how to think, they're taught what to think. Well, if you know what to think about everything to begin with, you're not going to be any kind of journalist.
No, I think the present company now, excluded from what I'm about to say, but I think the finer journalists I met over the years, their major wasn't journalism. Their major was something else. It might have been history, it might have been economics, and they kind of fell into it. And no, I don't consider myself to be a great journalist. I'm not. I don't fish for compliments. I'm not. But I'm kind of happy that journalism wasn't my major. It wasn't, and I ended up going into it. I was invited into radio, and I worked with some great people. And I think that probably helped me not to become like those,
Well, I mean, I can throw into that, Richie, because I don't have any major.
Yeah.
I didn't go to college.
You did your apprenticeship, though.
Well, I did, yeah, but I came up to all kind of a series. I worked in all kinds of jobs before I went into journalism, I was a roadie for a band. I was a van driver, a postman. I was all kinds of things, a clerk in an office in the railways, I was all kinds of things. And that kind of, I think that's an essential formation for the world. Because the problem is, if you actually receive all your knowledge, or the majority of it, through book learning, which is not rooted in actual experiential stuff, then it's going to be highly theoretical, and you're going to be trying to make connections between theories as opposed between the theory and reality and the other theory, and then try to connect them that way in a triangular kind of way. That it's a different thing. If you think about it, like, the old generations, my father and my uncles and my grandmother, like, they were very sensible people, but they had zero education virtually. They were very smart people in dealing with the world and in working the world out, because a lot of them worked with their hands and they were making things and they saw how the world fitted together. My father was a trained mechanic, and he would apply the same kind of methodology to politics. Like, that to work out a problem or to see why something was happening.
Yeah.
It's a different form of intelligence. And I think that one of the things I've kind of stumbled on when I talked about this pseudo-reality, one of the reasons that I think they've been successful with this COVID scam is because of actually the extent of a pseudo form of education, where people are highly educated, very highly schooled in particular narrow disciplines, and they're expert at that. But they can't join the dots with other disciplines.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that when you're in that, you see, that's your training, you're a sucker for, complicated schemas, explanations, theories about things. And you're a sucker for this kind of so-called pseudoscience, for what they call science.
Right.
And you become passionate about it, and you become a zealot for it, as opposed to the person who is simply like a farmer who says, well, and I've had experiences of lots of animal viruses, but I've never seen one acting like that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That person will actually have real hard experience that will say, I don't know, I don't buy it. He mightn't be able to tell you in highly intellectual terms why he doesn't buy it, but he knows that's not the way the world works. And that's what I call intelligence, really deep intelligence. Whereas the other stuff can be fooled, because, if something sounds complicated enough, there's a kind of a pride that comes in being able to understand it, or thinking you understand it,
Putting
and
yourself
defend
above,
that to the death rather than admit you were wrong.
That's a brilliant, not a theory, but that's a wonderful, well, let's say it's a theory, your theory of why people are like that. That is fascinating. And I can say this, I'm in Salford, I'm in a working class housing estate in Waterford, in Salford. I grew up in a housing estate in Ballybeg in Waterford. I'm now living in one in Salford, not far from Langworthy Road. And the folks I meet who don't buy it are older folks who have worked in the flour mills and the factories around Salford, most of whom don't know anything about what it is I do. I don't talk about the show, but those are the ones that I've, things are a bit strange, because I'll always say that, things are a bit strange, aren't they? And the ones who say it's nonsense, and maybe, they don't put too many... They don't put too many sentences together to explain why. Yeah, it's people who have worked, it's people with life experience. And they're like, this is bollocks.
Our culture has got to disparage that form of intelligence. But it's a very big mistake. because you can overrate the book learning, like the great Irish poet Patrick Kavanagh used to have a saying about that. He said that there are two forms of ignorance. One is ignorance of things, and he says that can be cured. He says, by reading books. He says, but there's another form of ignorance. He says, a different kind, and it's ignorance with. I can't remember what he said, ignorance with or ignorance by, but he says. That's incurable, he says, because the more books you read, the worse it gets.
Yeah, and I've just been told by two people. One of them is Jean Ann Crowley, who I'm very fond of, and another one is an email I've just had, lamenting the death of the long form interview. When I listened to talk radio when I was younger, Irish talk radio, one of the things I loved was when someone like yourself or someone else would speak on a program, and there wouldn't be any kind of time constraints, that you could flesh out, an idea or a theory. And of course, the media has destroyed that concept. The long form interview, it's dead.
That's exactly right. Like you think about it, like the whole format now, particularly television, but radio too, is to hector and badger the guest.
Yeah.
Right. And that's one of the great strengths that has emerged, paradoxically, out of YouTube, where and then of course on radio as well, of course, the like channels like yourselves, like and like yourself, and in America, that the kind of those kind of in-depth conversations.
Well, Joe Rogan does it brilliantly on Spotify,
and so like when you actually sit in, it's an amazing thing, Richie. I know this from my own experience of it, like that. You sit into when you get to like the style of a presenter like that. God, it's a wonderful feeling, because you're sitting there and there's like a 2 or 3.5 hour kind of interview, and you think, but you sit there and next thing you feel, I'm among friends here, because they're actually teasing out the issues, and they're not necessarily giving each other a soft ride or anything like that, but they're actually respectful and engaging, and they're discursive. They're not hectoring and lecturing and badgering the way in the Paxman style, or in the Paxman had other good qualities. I'm not slagging him, but he had good qualities as a journalist, I think. But that style has become very, very. I can't stick it anymore now. I don't do it. I don't listen to it. I don't watch it. And I used to a lot. I used to watch things like Newsnight and all those kind of Panorama. I used to love those kinds of programs. I can't do it anymore because of the ideological bias and that tone, which is like they're trying to catch you out all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how many times you and I have spoke. There are things we see differently and slightly differently. But it's one of the things I'm most proud about how this particular show has developed, and it's kind of by accident, really, is that listeners do say to us, especially on the comments, they say, it's nice, Richie, that you'll have people on, they see it differently. But you see, that's how we were brought up. When I was brought up at WLR, like if the thing was, find somebody to come on and make an argument against, something that you might kind of hold dear, and listen to them. And let them finish the sentence, and then say, right, fair enough, but what about that? And then shut the fuck up then, and let them answer that. That's the way we were kind of educated to do it, Well,
there's another phenomenon that fits into this, and I don't know whether it's the chicken or the egg or how these things work, but I mean, it's the idea that, and I don't know when this started, maybe about 10, 15 years ago, that, to have a different opinion in certain categories was regarded as a moral failure.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And that was the whole point, that there was an element of shaming and all that stuff then. It crept into the media. That it wasn't just that they wanted to kind of prove you're wrong. They wanted to prove you're a bad person.
Yeah. For thinking as you did. Yeah.
That destroyed that whole model then, you see. And it's unwatchable now because it's toxic. And that's what paradoxically I said, because YouTube was the channel that really put this out to the ether, in recent times. But of course, YouTube is completely, it's a deep state creation.
Well, it was a trap, wasn't it? It was a finger trap, basically. Yeah, you come and have your big discussions and your free speech here. Yeah, until such time as we
don't
tell you to stop.
We don't like what you're
You've
saying,
just set off something in my brain again. That's why I love these conversations. You talk there about not just trying to prove somebody wrong, but trying to prove them morally wrong. I remember when I was younger, they gave us a free channel whatever the cable provider was in Waterford, they gave us a free channel called Lifestyle. You might have had it in the West, you might have had it in Dublin as well. And all of a sudden, I was exposed as an 11, 12-year-old lad to Sally, Jesse, Raphael talk show in America, Montel, Geraldo. Now, not all of them were great, but some of them were brilliant. I used to like Sally, Jesse, Raphael. She would have on the Clan. And people like that, and these are people with terrible kind of life outlooks, I would say, the Ku Klux Klan. But what Sally Jesse was doing, and to a lesser extent Geraldo, was genuinely portraying these people as human beings and trying to get to the bottom of why they felt as they did about black people and about Jews. And I thought this was magnificent. They weren't bringing them on to humiliate them or to make them look like morons. Jerry Springer did that later on. But before that, they were actually trying to find out why you seem to be nice. You seem to have a good relationship with your children. You bring them up properly. Why do you actually feel like that? I mean, Christ, that was brilliant. That's the kind of stuff inspired me, I think.
Yes, and who knows, what kind of, redemption can emerge out of that as well, and that's the thing, that now people just want to say, oh, I'm this, I'm not racist, I'm anti-racism, I'm anti-fascism, and then that's their whole thing, and that's become deeply ingrained in journalism, where they go on about the far right. Anybody they don't agree with is the far right,
that's right.
And all this sort of nonsense. And the result is that they've destroyed their business model. They think that it's purely because of competitive. Well, I mean, it was in the advertising market for sure. That was a part of it. But it was also ideological in the sense that they were actually attacking the people that they would have naturally expected to listen and watch what they were doing.
Can I tell you a quick story, a very quick one?
Yeah.
About 2 years ago, David Baddiel made a documentary on anti-Semitism for the BBC. And his producer rang me up 3 or 4 times and said, would I be interviewed by David? And I said, yes, on the condition that my friend Hayden Hewitt of liveleak.com, that Hayden could record it in full. We would swear and sign a contract that we would never release it until after the BBC documentary goes out. And they said, well, why? And I said, well, I know you're going to try and stitch me up. Anyway, long story short, this was fascinating to me. This young woman was very nice. David wants to speak to you about why you've interviewed a Holocaust denier in the past and why you interviewed this guy in California, this politician, who was very, very much anti-Semitic. And I said, no problem. I said, I'll speak to him. So she said, why? Why did you have this guy on? And I had a Californian senatorial candidate on who believed that Jewish people have an evil gene, and this guy was doing really well. And I said to the producer for David Baddiel, I said, are you not fascinated by a wealthy, a well-presented, articulate man with a big house and a big family? Are you not fascinated why he thinks that Jewish people have an evil gene? And she said to me, well, he's obviously just... she said, her words were, he's a fuckwit, and, he's a racist, he's terrible. And I said, well... He's a lot more than that. He might very well be a racist and a fuckwit, but he's other things to other people too. Why would you not want to speak to a guy like that? And she couldn't get her head around it. She could not. She was like, well, the only reason you would interview him is basically to shout at him and call him a racist.
Well, you see, that's the thing, and you get the same racist thing. I mean, if you even raise the first question about the policy, the immigration policies of your country, now you're called a racist. And I don't take the view, for example. I mean, this Holocaust denial. I don't agree with that.
No,
I have no
neither.
reason to believe any of that whatsoever.
No.
But I totally object. Which in Ireland now they're bringing in a law to make it a criminal offence to deny the Holocaust. This is absolute nonsense. My immediate response to that, Richie, well, I say, okay, I'm prepared to accept that so long as you include the COVID Holocaust as part of that, right?
Yeah.
And that you can't deny that either, because that's happening right now.
Fantastic.
And, and these are the very same people who are making it happen and concealing that it's happening in terms of the vaccines are the ones who want to ban anybody from questioning the Jewish Holocaust, which I don't question at all.
No.
And this is the thing, this is nothing to do with caring for people.
No, they don't give a shit about Jewish people. You are 100% right. None of the people behind any of these laws or legislation give a damn about the sensitivities of Jewish people. And I'll tell you who's told me that. My accountant, who's a Jewish gentleman in North Manchester, he has no time for this either. and he said to me this idea of creating vulnerable groups, that I'm somehow vulnerable to hearing some idiot denying the Holocaust, and therefore the state has to intervene on my behalf. This is brilliant, and nobody wants to talk about that. From his point of view, I'm not vulnerable. I don't give an arse if some guy, doesn't believe the Holocaust happened. I do give an arse if some guy desecrates, a cemetery, or throws a stone at a bloke because he's wearing a skull cap. That's different. There are laws against that. Go and deal with it. But don't be putting people in jail because they say something didn't happen. And I love that attitude.
I agree entirely. I mean, it's this is all about power.
Yeah.
This is the cultural Marxist model. That you actually adopt, as it were, all these minorities who are supposedly vulnerable and all the rest of it, which is a deeply patronizing position to take, and then you use them as battering rams or as human shields, so you can promote and push ahead your own agenda, and you can conceal all kinds of things. You can then, for example, in the name of diversity, you can actually destroy diversity. Because you destroy the individuality of every society in the name of creating diversity, and you turn the whole human race into a kind of a stew. Do
you get angry, John? Can I ask? Do you get? I get it. I find myself. I'm a mild-mannered guy. My missus might say otherwise, but I'm mild-mannered. I'm generally even-tempered. I'm watching television these days, and every single advertisement, no, that's a lie. Many of the advertisements I'm seeing are featuring mixed-race couples. Now, my second cousin married a black lawyer called Harvey. Lovely fella, very happy couple. Very unusual, of course. An Irish girl. Fantastic. Who gives a shit ultimately? Yeah. But to be patronised like that by television advertisements, to be told that red is white and white is black and pink is purple. The great majority of couples in this country are couples who married within their own cultural or ethnic group. But if you watch television in the UK, well, you could be forgiven for thinking different.
The same is happening here now.
It's madness.
And it's actually a way of kind of deracinating the Irish people. It's a way of attacking their own sense of being the host population. Like, that's part of the globalist agenda, that there are no host populations. There is no such thing as an indigenous people. There is no such thing as natives. You are simply a consumer walking across the face of your country, not your country, sorry, across a piece of territory. As Thomas Davis, the great Irish patriot, said, a sandbank. Ireland is no sandbank, he used to say. And that's the point. That's what they're trying to destroy. It's got nothing to do with, their love of black people or any coloured people. It's got to do with their desire to destroy the culture that we have. And that's not, again, I mean, I personally no animosity towards any person of any ethnicity or colour or anything like that. And I'll talk to anybody that I meet. And if they're here in Ireland, they're welcome, as far as I'm concerned, on a personal basis. But I do question at a macro level the policies that essentially have invited the whole world to come into Ireland and not take any cognizance of the damage that will ensue to our culture unless we take steps to ensure that it doesn't.
Let me ask you this, and it'll be the final question. I'm not going to be devil's advocate. I'm going to ask you an honest question. What about those who would say, "I give over with this feckin' culture talk, John"? What culture? We've long ceased to be playwrights and poets, and cultivators of the land. We turned into a nation of consumers and pissheads who go to the match and get pissed up on stout, and that's all we really are. What culture are you talking about? People will say that to me regularly.
Yeah, well, you see, that's all very well, but that's the process that we're talking about.
Yeah.
And that leads to absolute perdition. Once if you think it's bad now, wait till you see when the conflict that will arise in these communities where people will return to their most profound ethnicities and become antagonistic to each other because nobody listened to them at the time when they said, well, look, can we get a little bit of space to breathe?
Yeah.
I say that to people, you think that, when you call me a racist for questioning these policies, you think that if you ignore me, and you will, that this will go on and that'll be the end of it. Well, let me tell you, the people who are coming after me will not be interested in talking.
Yeah. Listen, we're bang up on time. You've been very generous because we said we go to 6:30. You can read John at johnwaters.substack.com. john.substack.com. John and Gemma O'Doherty did something historic yesterday. They challenged the constitutionality of the lockdowns. Well, what they actually did was they fought for their right to challenge the constitutionality and the legality of the lockdowns. They argued before the Supreme Court. Not many people get to say they did that. So I'm genuinely, mate, I know it might sound like fucking bullshit, but it isn't. I'm genuinely proud of the both of you.
Thank you so much, Richie. I really am. I mean, it's funny. Yeah, you're right. I wrote a thing last week there about, just before we go, that even the occasion, to be in the Supreme Court, it's a wonderful honour, in lots of ways. And it struck me. I remember, like, there was a footballer down my way, down Roscommon, the Rossies, Jimmy Murray, way back in the 40s. He was the captain of the All-Ireland, the team that won the All-Ireland twice in the 40s. And he was, years later, quite recently, he's dead now, I think, but he was asked on the All-Ireland morning, he says, what advice would you give to the players going out on the pitch today? And he said, the most important thing, he says, is to enjoy the day, because this is one of the greatest days of your life. And you need to take it in, absorb it, so that you remember it and celebrate it, when you're an old fella, And that, I took that advice. And even though I was nervous and all the rest of it, I have a great sense of, there was a certain majesty to the occasion, and to the fact that we made it and we didn't back down, and we said we're going, and that's it. We've been kicked back once, twice, but we're still going. And that's, I think, in all humility, I would say to people, that's the example I would like people to take from this. Do not back down.
Brilliant, John. Don't be a stranger. Will you come back on anytime you want? Don't wait to be asked, John. Love having you on.
Thanks. I will indeed, Richie. Whenever there's anything to tell you, I'll be on.
Give us a shout. And God bless, and all the best with the result, with the opinion. I can't wait for it. I'm sure you can't either. Thanks a million, John.
Thanks, Richie. God bless.
Fantastic. That was John Waters, johnwaters.substack.com. Please go and read him. Support journalists like John, one of Ireland's greatest columnists, and he really is, by the way.